Okay, I'm Kate Johnston. I'm on the Board of Trustees at Upstart Scotland, and it's my absolute delight to welcome Julie Fisher to this webinar. Poor Julie, she's always being harassed by me. And when I went on a wonderful webinar that she did for the launch of this book, this new edition of Starting with the Child, it's delightful to have Julie here, and I can't wait to hear what she's doing. Julie has been a head teacher of two urban multicultural schools. She's been an early years advisor. She's been a professor of early education, and now she's the visiting professor of early childhood at Oxford Brookes University. And she's also won the Nursery World Lifetime Achievement Awards, and she is an early education associate. Is that right, Julie?
Yep, pretty much so.
I've got it right. Oh, lovely. We've got some real advocates for play on this. Yeah, so there's going to be some great questions. Wonderful. I'm very excited about this. Great. Thank you all for coming. So if you could all mute yourself, I'm going to hand over to Julie, and she's going to talk for a while, and then at the end we'll have a Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Thank you for the warmth of the welcome. It's a real pleasure to be invited to lead the seminar this evening. A pleasure because I've spent many rewarding in-service days working with some of you in various parts of the country and being inspired by your practice and learning the differences that exist between the policy and pedagogy between our two nations. And I hope that behind the camera, there are many faces that I know. Okay, we look to Scotland, you know, from England with some amount of envy. Envy because you do not seem to face many of the pressures that we face here in England for an ever more formal early years curriculum. And because you have national guidance documentation stemming from the principles enshrined in the Curriculum for Excellence and wonderfully illuminated by realising the ambition. And they seem to demonstrate that you have at least some politicians who are grasping those crucial messages about best practice in the early years that you and colleagues like you, I know, have fought to establish over so many years. If I live and work in Scotland, perhaps I would never have had to have written the book. Perhaps I would never have had to write what it's like to start from the child and the challenges it brings. However, that book is the one that I've been asked to talk about, and I suspect that despite our different political masters and the differences that inevitably brings, that some of the tensions I will talk about from here in England will resonate with many of you up north of the border. I will just wave, I'm very glad Kate waved interacting or interfering, but I'll just wave the new edition of Starting from the Child so you have an idea of what it looks like. Okay, I'll put that down. Now, nearly 30 years ago now, I wrote a book called Starting from the Child, and it had a question mark at the end of the title. And it was written in response to some overwhelming concerns in England at the time about the impending introduction of government legislation focused on early childhood education and the potential impact that this could have on some long-held and deeply cherished principles and practices. In the 4 editions that followed, I took the question mark away. The early years foundation stage, as it became known in England, was introduced and substantial funding followed so that there was an incredible amount of training for all early childhood educators, whether they worked in schools or in the PVI sector. And local authority teams of early years experts expanded. And suddenly the early years was being taken seriously. But inevitably, of course, the increased government intervention did cause impact on both practitioners and on children. But I think, you know, that many of us were so pleased to be taken seriously for once, pleased to be engaged in building very strong local communities of early years specialists, learning and developing together, that we kind of overlooked that creeping standardization and formalization that was taking place. Over the past 10 years in particular, between Kate's edition 4 and the new edition 5, which Kate will tell you exactly why you have to buy edition 5, there's been a growing awareness, I think, of the inexorable shift in the expectations being placed on the sector. Expectations stemming, of course, by government legislation, by government documentation, but also enforced often way beyond their mandate by Ofsted, our regulation and inspection agency. And these expectations impacted on our educators and therefore, of course, on our children. Because when Starting from the Child with a question mark was first published, the role of the early childhood educator had been largely seen to be one that facilitated learning, that supported and encouraged learning. And I was reminded when I went out on my very first teaching practice to inspire children. But ever increasing levels of government intervention and prescription has shifted the experiences of children from adult inspired learning to adult insisted learning. Now, there are aspects of the EYFS curriculum, most notably in the teaching of reading and the prescriptive nature of the phonics programs to be used, that have changed that familiar supportive role of the early childhood educator from "would you like to?" and "can I help you to?" to one that says, "I'm afraid you have to." And this pressure, of course, is chiefly exerted in the reception year, the final year of our EYFS, which most children undertake once they enter primary school. But we all know that any pressure, any set of expectations, any set of goals or standards to be reached, end up creating downward pressure on younger and younger children. And too many nurseries, it seems, now see their role as getting children ready for the reception class and reception practices that are to come. If you have to learn to sabotage, if you have to learn to hold a pencil in a tripod grip, if you have to learn at least 10 digraphs by the end of the reception year, all of which are early learning goals for our children, then you'll jolly well have to come here so I can teach you, because you won't find that kind of learning in a sandpit. The EYFS was, of course, intended to bring about standardization within the sector, and standards were, in fairness, very variable. But when standards are set that have to be achieved and goals are set that have to be reached, then how to achieve those outcomes needs to be controlled. And as all of you know, young children are not always terribly compliant about our attempts to control them. Indeed, surely the very strength of early childhood education has been in handing control to the child to strengthen and celebrate their agency, not removing it in order to gain control for ourselves. But the government had a dilemma. They found out that the main way that children were learning in the early years seemed to be through exploration and play. And so how was it possible for them to control the outcomes, to control the children, when the process, and therefore outcomes, were still in the control of the child? So they thought, and I probably paraphrase, that we cannot control the children, it seems, so we need to control the educators. Each iteration of the EYFS, and there have been a number, have chronicled additional expectations layered on the role of the early childhood educator and the outcomes they are expected to achieve from their children. So learning has been initiated more by practitioners, led more by practitioners, insisted on by practitioners. And what the educator wants the child to learn is too often privileged over what the child wants to learn. So this latest edition of Starting from the Child put the question mark back. It, whilst aiming to address the tensions between the needs of the child to control their own learning and the needs of practitioners to control the learning for them, I have tried to carve a path that recognizes that we have to take account of both. Because, of course, there are things that children will only learn if we teach it to them. Or we cannot guarantee that all children will learn unless we teach it to them. So just things like how to hold a saw safely before you go to the woodwork table. Maybe how to mix paint or how to use scissors. Maybe how to bake a cake so you can take yourself off in the future and do it independently. How to talk about your feelings, how to write recognizable letters. All of these things are more likely to be taught before children can then use those skills independently. But what we must never let others forget is that there are things that the adult-led agenda can never teach and will only come about, will only develop through a child's own self-initiated, self-driven exploration and play. Those things that we are so passionate about, that we campaign about. Things like children's independence, their skills of problem solving, their capacity to use their initiative. All of those things, that long and vital list, come about through child-led learning, not adult-led learning. So we have to find a balance. And the balance changes, I guess, with the age of the child, their own prior experience, their current needs, and any demands that we face from that external prescriptive agenda. But what all of us who work with and teach young children know is that when children find learning meaningful, then they are motivated by it. It encourages them to persevere. It draws out their creativity, and it makes them want to go on learning. But externally imposed expectations in England currently mean that too often for some children, towards the end of the EYFS, learning sometimes does not have meaning. In fact, is meaningless to them. It therefore doesn't necessarily interest them. Therefore, it makes their learning harder. It often requires them to sit still and listen a lot. And it takes them away from what they want to learn, prioritizing and privileging what the adult wants instead. I think when educational programs are a one-size-fits-all rather than couture, then it cannot possibly suit all children. The primary principle of our EYFS is the unique child. And yet here we are with a system demanding standardization and universality. But when teaching is designed to cover the same material in the same sequence with the same approach to the same ends, irrespective of uniqueness and individuality, then there are inevitably children whom the approach won't fit. What happens if the approach doesn't fit you? What happens if you're not the child for whom literacy and numeracy, the areas of learning prioritised by our government, is a breeze and your very favourite thing? What happens if these are the two things that you are made to do every day and with which you struggle the most? Well, then your self-esteem takes a tumble. Your confidence gets bruised. Your desire to have a go and take risks, essential parts of being a successful learner, shrink just a bit each time as you fail. And that's when children become anxious. That's when they stop wanting to come to school. Because when children are anxious, when children are distressed, when they're frustrated or angry about what they cannot do, then they can become disruptive. And much of the poor behaviour that's reported in our Key Stage 1, your primary 1 and 2, is a cry for help, a cry to enjoy learning more, a cry to feel competent again, a cry to have control back. And I don't believe that's always adequately understood. Thinking about this talk, I realised that one of the things that strikes me about education, early childhood education, when I was a young teacher and now, is that then nobody cried. And now I'm sad to say that sometimes on courses, at conferences, teachers cry. They cry because they know they're being asked to deliver initiatives, programs that they don't believe are in the best interests of their children, or certainly all their children. And children didn't cry. Children didn't cry because they had to leave their models or their mud kitchens or their role play to sit for interminable lengths of time having their daily phonics session. So both children and teachers cry now, and that should tell us something about the pressure that some are under. Pressure to perform, pressure to dance to somebody else's tune. And that, as I say, is why the question mark has come back at the end of edition 5. Because in this educational climate in which we find ourselves in England, which places the needs of educators sometimes above the needs of children, then I have to ask, is it possible any longer to start from the child? Now, you will be pleased to know that I still believe the answer is yes. I haven't got time this evening to go into all of the arguments, but I hope that if you pick up a copy of the book, then you will find some of the solutions that I suggest. But you know, in England, it's not just children in our EYFS who are anxious and upset and turned off, but also children who are leaving the EYFS to move into our Key Stage 1. So those children who are 4 going on to 5 and moving into our Key Stage 1. And this is one of the areas of research that I've been working on for a number of years. That transition from children from that one phase to the other, where in the one phase, they are subject to the statutory framework for the EYFS, in the other to the national curriculum, both of which have standards that are expected to be achieved by the end of them. When I first became concerned about this transition, I scoured the child development literature, trying to find a rationale for the difference that children were experiencing between their, at best, child-centered, play-based early years world and the world of greater formality that they were meeting in year 1. I was looking for arguments that said that play was no longer necessary, by the time you reach the age of 5, that children really enjoy sitting and listening for ages to the teacher while they tell them all the things that they need to learn. That suddenly at this age, they no longer want to be outside, but would far rather stay inside in order to learn. Well, of course, you know that I found no rationale for any of that. But what I did find were possibly reasons between the differences. And it became quite apparent that the people who had designed the EYFS were not the same people who had designed the national curriculum. So we did not have a seamless policy. And therefore, we had 2 entirely different educational approaches being promulgated, entirely different outcomes being expected, and entirely different pedagogy being promoted. The gulf that was there then and is still there now in many schools has been compounded, I think, by government expectations, and particularly by Ofsted expectations, that a major rationale for year 1 is to get, for the EYFS is to get children ready for year 1. So catching up with the start of the national curriculum rather than building on and being seamless with the foundation stage. No attention was paid to the child's development literature that would have informed any reader that it's not at age 5 that a developmental spurt occurs, but at age 7. And that if a different pedagogy should be introduced, it should happen at the end of Key Stage 1, rather than at the beginning. Now, inevitably, I've been fascinated to listen to the Scottish Parliament's recent debate about fostering the discussion about a kindergarten stage in Scotland. And within that very reasoned debate, I thought, I could tell that it was clearly prompted and inspired by people like yourselves, by Upstart Scotland. And I heard from the politicians some very familiar benefits and some very familiar concerns. One that was, some children at age 5 or 6 are ready for school. Now, indeed, that might be the case. It's true, as was mentioned, I think the politician's name was Martin Whitfield, that there are some schools in Scotland, and indeed there are in England, where the transition at this stage is already seamless, or certainly working towards seamless, where staff have worked tirelessly to bring about that pedagogical change. But it is not the norm throughout England by any means, and often rests on a very knowledgeable or committed head teacher or year 1 teacher to inspire the development that's necessary, and which too often stutters and dies when they leave the school. But let's return to those who are school ready, ready for school. This usually suggests that the children who are ready for what the school expects. They're ready to sit still, to respond to what the teacher asks, to listen and to learn, particularly around those recognisable subjects of literacy and numeracy, once again. But I think it's important to remind ourselves and others about how they came to be ready. Because most of the children who are school ready have been those who, from their birth, have been introduced to all the activities and experiences that enable them to manage what teachers expect of them, who've had stories read, been on outings and visits to interesting places, had conversations and interactions with all the important people in their lives, had words and numbers pointed out as they walked down the street, being taught to write their name, and so on and so on. So they arrive in school and it is a welcoming and familiar place. I know what to do here. I'm already pretty good at this stuff. And of course, that's great. It's great for those children. But for many children, there is no such preparation. And it's these children that have always concerned me most. It doesn't mean that those children do not know anything. It doesn't mean that they don't come to our nurseries and our classrooms and our Key Stage 1 without skills and knowledge and competencies that would be demonstrated to any teacher that bothered to try and find out about them. But when those skills and knowledge and competencies are supposed to be only of a specific kind, the specific kind that make you school ready, then many children already have an uphill battle. So when school has that fixed idea of what readiness looks like, of what ability looks like, then too many children will be excluded from that definition. And of course, because some children are ready, that does not mean all are. And that's the big problem I have about a system that privileges the children who are already privileged. And an education policy that deems that Key Stage 1, your primary one, as the start of formal primary education, and assumes that all children, ready or not, willing or not, will have the same set of experiences, be treated as some homogeneous whole, taking little account of previous experience, preferred ways of learning, or interests, then we have a problem for a large segment of our children in our classrooms. Because for me, a developmentally appropriate curriculum means that it's appropriate for all children. It has the flexibility and the individuality and the respect for the uniqueness of children that it makes us as individuals be flexible and unique in our response in turn. I don't know what kind of education and experience it is that chooses to disadvantage the disadvantaged, the most vulnerable, the most reluctant. When the system and its expectations are too tightly prescribed, to allow those individual approaches to individualize learning, then too many children will automatically fail to meet the targets and the goals that are set. And I think the Scottish Parliament very rightly in their debate focused on these groups and the international research that reminds us that it is these vulnerable and disadvantaged children who benefit most from the highest quality early childhood education where play is at its heart. I'm sure most of you have heard about our Sure Start programme in England, and there's been a very recent review of that. The last government closed down most of the Sure Start centres. But the research has showed, and I will just read what it says here, that high quality play environments in those centres saw significant improvement in educational outcomes lasting right up to GCSE level, which for our children is age 16. That the GCSE outcomes were 6 times higher for those eligible for free school meals, and that overall larger impacts were seen for those from poorest backgrounds and non-white backgrounds. So we see that developmentally appropriate practices are not just good for children's immediate development, their health, their well-being, crucial though that is, but as the parliamentary debate attested, it's also vital for their futures and for the economic well-being of the country. Because in this fast-paced, rapidly changing world of the 21st century, where AI and climate change and green technology will demand those who think outside the box, rather than those who've had an education experience constrained by being put in a box. And the skills of flexibility and problem solving and thinking on your own two learning feet that I referred to earlier will not only be desirable, but necessary. So, what are the future of our campaigns, both north and south of the border? I think I've chosen 3 things. You may want to add your own at the end, but the first, I think, is we must continue to start from the child. That's not just a sales pitch for the book. It's what I truly believe. I wouldn't be in early childhood education any longer if I didn't still believe that. We have to remember and remind those who would seek to make learning in the early years a homogeneous activity, that in the early years, this doesn't work, that we have to remain focused on that unique child with all of their gloriously idiosyncratic ways. Isn't that one of the things that keeps us in this work? If we turned out the same children by the same methods and the same mechanisms, how dull teaching would be, certainly of young children. And then we have to explain to those who seek to make the demands of adults and their needs more significant than the needs of children and their needs and their goals, that at this early cognitive stage, they're making learning harder. Children want to learn what they want to learn. As soon as we impose things on them, it often makes that learning less meaningful, less motivating, and therefore inevitably harder. And if we must introduce children to formal education at an age younger than I believe is necessary, then again, we have to realize that the chances are we will have to work a lot harder because they will be less inclined to learn what it is we want them to learn. There are 2 phrases that I love in the most recent definition of appropriate, developmentally appropriate practice that comes from the National Association for the Education of Young Children. And they say in their definition now that practice should depend on methods that promote each child's optimal development through a strengths-based, what I can do, play-based approach to joyful, engaged learning. Joyful, engaged learning. When I go into a setting, that's what I look for. And if it's not there, there's a problem for the child, and there's often a problem for the educator who's working hard to try and make something unpalatable, enjoyable. And the second phrase is taking care to not harm any aspect of each child's physical, cognitive, social, or emotional well-being. That's not a bad yardstick, you know, for the experiences that our young children are having. Do they do harm? Are they turning children off learning rather than encourage them to go on being lifelong learners? Then secondly, we must fight. We must go on fighting, however tired we are, however repetitious it may seem. We have to fight against ignorance. We have to fight against homogenization. We have to fight against standardization and conformity. A wonderful group of experts called the Early Years Curriculum Group wrote back in, I would think, about 1992, that there is potential in all children which emerges powerfully under favorable conditions. So that's what we have to provide, favorable conditions, so that whatever your background, whatever your story, whatever your strengths, they'll be celebrated and recognized. They will be built on and developed And then, and only then, will children have the confidence to learn something new, will have the confidence and the courage to take risks and to try what is currently more challenging. I have a great belief that every child, every day, should have the chance to shine and thrive. Not those children who are school ready, but all children. And only when they do so, and they will only do so if the education in both of our countries, I think, recognises the needs of all children, rather than that narrow set of children who are ready for school. So I applaud and support the debate on a kindergarten stage in Scotland. But my challenge to Upstart Scotland, if I may be, well, in fact, I was asked to be courageous enough to say it, is that my third comment would be we must start from conception. With everything that's known about learning in the womb, let alone in the earliest years of birth, I don't think any early childhood education policy can begin at age 3. Because it suggests that before the age of 3, children's education is of little concern, that it's all about childcare. But you know, as long ago in 2009, I found in your Scottish Early Years Framework, the words, it's during our very earliest years and even pre-birth that a large part of the pattern for our future adult life is set. In the womb, children are forming millions of connections every second, from the experiences they're having, the sounds that they're having, the feelings that they're having, the sensations that they're having. They're learning by experience, by repetition, by association. And if this is happening in utero, how much more is learned as soon as the baby is born and surrounded by all the intense sensory stimuli of the world in which they've been catapulted. Both parents and early childhood educators need to know how vital their role is from conception in developing children's learning, their ideas about the world, their knowledge and understanding. And politicians who still are often concerned with childcare for economic purposes and use the word childcare as an umbrella term, which too often still seems to some like babysitting. They need to understand that education and care begin in the womb and are inextricably linked. And whilst there will undoubtedly be another battle to be fought about what education looks like at 2 months old, we can no longer be satisfied, I think, with any early years policy that does not start from conception. So your challenge, I believe, at Upstart Scotland is to remind all of those stakeholders, the politicians, the parents, the practitioners, that for the sake of the children, this is a golden opportunity to debate and hopefully implement a kindergarten stage in Scotland, but it must be birth to 7. I'll stop there and see what your feelings are and whether there are other things that you feel are a challenge for you all. So thank you for now.
Wow. Well, you even had the chat box going, which is great. Thank you so much, Julie. You've got 15 minutes to ask Julie Fisher a question. Ailey's saying that a nothing to 7 teacher qualification is amazing. Yeah.
Can I just pick up while you're looking, what Michelle is saying about currently developing a play-based approach for pupils in P4. Michelle, I hope I acknowledged and recognized that there are schools that are doing an amazing job in taking a play-based approach through the school. But having worked with a number of schools here in England, What I know is, again, was the point I made, that it very often depends on the drive of one person, or maybe two or three. But if one person drops out, if the P2 teacher isn't in accord, or the P3 teacher goes off and goes somewhere else, it can wobble. It's not strong enough. And I think policy has to be in place to help all of you who are in your individual ways doing the very best that you can do, for it to be robust right across the sector. So it's not, oh, isn't that wonderful, but that it's the norm. And that's what we all want, isn't it? That it's the norm.
So Karen Taggart's asking,
Yeah.
what do we think about, I think it's Sweden that is lowering its school starting age to 6 from 7. People keep saying Finland, but I'm sure it's Sweden. I've been talking to Suzanne Axelsson about it. So what do you think about that? Where we're trying to raise it to 7.
Yes. Well, I think this shows that all governments are prone to fluctuating what they think and what they believe according to the pressures that are exerted. It would be interesting to know if the teachers in Sweden agree with that, or whether the pressure has come from economic sources, or from the kind of information that I've just found out about, and some of you may know about this, that there's a cross-national look at PISA assessments for 5-year-olds. Now, the minute, as I said earlier, that you have tests or standards that government is worried about children reaching, then they will try more and more to control those outcomes. And if Sweden don't feel they're doing well enough, they're taking back control from children and saying, all right, then you must be good at this, because else we will not go up the tables. And we do know that the trouble with these narrow assessments is that they so often don't assess the things that we would value as early childhood specialists. So whilst we may acknowledge that reading and maths and other aspects of the curriculum have immense value, we would not necessarily say that by doing it younger and younger, children will do better and better at it. My argument, as I've said this evening, is that if you pressurize children to do something that they don't quite understand why they're having to do it, it becomes meaningless, and therefore they're not as motivated, and many of them will simply fail because they're not ready for that more formalized learning. So I don't know what the rationale is behind, and I will research it. But all the time we have to say who's exerting pressure. And that's why I say what all of us need is the liberation and the emancipation, if you like, that comes from having a government who says, actually, there are things beyond literacy and numeracy. There are things about well-being. There are things about creativity. There are things about physical development. There are things about knowledge and understanding of the world. There are things about loving learning that we actually think matters more at 5 and 6.
Yeah,
that's where I stand.
I mean,
where I stand.
There's comments in the chat about how it's the government and LAs who are driving the literacy and numeracy thing because they gather data on it, sadly.
Yeah.
And that, I heard a really sad story at the weekend of a school who had been moving towards play from nursery into primary 1 and further up, and then a change at the top and the LA changing the thing, and now they're moved into a much more formal state. And so it's so dependent on what is happening from above and the pressures there. Readiness for school. I mean, they're doing it all the wrong way round.
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly. I mean, you know, I haven't got time to go into all the detail of the things that I believe about this transition, but certainly there is no doubt that when the head teacher is supportive, when the head teacher is knowledgeable, when the head teacher is courageous, because let's face it, you know, you don't change practice and pedagogy overnight. And particularly if a P1, P2 teacher is not familiar with an early years pedagogy, it takes time to become skilled. And there may be, and I say this to head teachers, there may be a dip in standards, heaven preserve us. But
Yeah.
if you have the courage to hold on, then as people get more skilled at supporting a play-based approach, if they get more skilled at balancing this more hybrid way of, yes, we acknowledge the formality, but it doesn't overtake and become more important than the play,
Yeah.
then I think, that's the way we have to go.
Well, Gillian says they don't use the term any longer ready for school or school readiness in their transition, which is brilliant.
That's really, Gillian, that's really good. I used the term because I heard it used in the parliamentary debate. So I deliberately picked up a bit on it because the language that our politicians use belies what they believe. So there was ready for school used, and there was also a lot of childcare being used when people meant early learning and childcare.
Yeah, and Alison's saying that policy change is good, but she's got her school involved with leading in the school improvement group for 4+ years, but with support from the senior leadership team. And what Martine is saying, that head teachers need to understand the rationale for play. And in Play is the Way, we have a chapter on that and how Falkirk trained their head teachers or supported their head teachers to understand why play at the early years was such a benefit to their children. And that then helped the rollout across Falkirk. And they've seen, no deterioration in where the children are, rather happy, engaged, loving, learning learners, which is what we want. Oh, there's more, sorry. I'm just trying to keep up with this. Yeah, I thoroughly agree. Somebody said this, I love this one, sorry. Oh, yes, and it's Martine. There should be compulsory early years training for head teachers.
Well, I mean, I've been calling for that for a long time in England. I think it's shameful that somebody can take over a primary school, never having taught a child less than 9 years old. And certainly when I was a local authority advisor, we insisted that if people didn't have the experience, they did a year's training that we, as the local authority, had planned for them so that they didn't make ignorant policies within their own school, and they didn't barricade the kind of developments that we've been talking about tonight.
Yeah. I mean, Upstart would hope that child development became part of all teacher training, even secondary teachers.
Yes.
Because everybody needs to know about it, don't they?
Of course they do.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Play pedagogy, child development, and outdoor learning. That's what we would hope for everybody.
Yes, that would do.
And that's what we're fighting for. So
excellent.
Keep following us.
Excellent.
Why do we have, we've got an avalanche of documents. It's not necessary. We just need to listen to people like Julie. Anybody with a question? More chats? Yeah. Oh no. Poor Angela has got to deliver maths and numeracy daily. They don't have a choice.
Well, I think, Angela, this is where, we could get into a whole different series of seminars here, but this is where we have to find the balance. You can still deliver language and maths through play, although if you are being given programs to deliver it, there is still a lot of time. That's where we get into how the day is organized. I always say that the first thing to do is to look at the timetable to see how much time children are stopped from learning, interrupted from learning, to go out to play or to go to lunch or to wherever they go, and to try and make the day longer and more seamless without those unnecessary interruptions. So it is possible. It's hard, but it's possible to deliver language and maths every day, but firstly, sometimes through play, and even if it's discreetly, to have play around it. It's about how the timetable is organized.
Yeah. We have had
Okay.
a fabulous time. Would you agree, everybody? I'm sure you would. Thank
Okay,
you
well, thank you
so
for the
much.
invitation, Kate.
So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Julie.
Pleasure.
Right.
Take
and we'll
care, everyone. Good night.
Okay. Take care, everybody.